We're ready.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. This is a very special place, as you all know, those who are students here, doing work that isn't being done like this anywhere else in my experience. And as many of you know too, or you will find out, when you get out into the work world and you're traveling all over the world, there are members of the Monterey Mafia virtually everywhere you go. In embassies all over, globally, and in missions and so forth. So this is a program that has thrown its people out and has really developed an incredible reputation. So it's a pleasure to be here. It's also, you're doing work on the NPT that's not being done anywhere else. And the NPT, as Bill mentioned, I've been involved in off and on over the years, 3 review conferences, 3 strikes I was out, and that's when I decided to retire a couple years ago. But it's near and dear to my heart, and when we get to the conclusions, I can tell you how I feel about the treaty. Let me just say that the views and observations I'm going to offer are my personal views. I am retired, but I do consult for the State Department and the Department of Energy, and my views do not represent the U.S. government or any organization that I'm associated with, although I'm not so sure that most of them would be, at odds with that, but I am here in personal capacity. So this topic, this was something that I worked on this summer. The whole issue was the NPT failing and could it, and the death or the near death of the NPT has been a topic of conversation at almost every review conference. I mean, that's the purpose of the review conference, to look at how well the treaty is working, and then to come up with recommendations and conclusions on how to make it work better. And that's, that is the review process. But the whole issue of whether or not the treaty was failing, or was it past its sell-by date, or whatever, started to get more attention as I looked at it after what I consider the debacle of the 2005 NPT Review Conference. I was not involved in the 2005 NPT Review Conference, but I do think, looking at that was a disaster that had many fathers and mothers. It was not just the U.S., there were many that were responsible for that failure. And so as we headed into 2010, when I came back into non-proliferation to work on that, as I looked out over this, there was an awful lot of gloomy literature out there predicting the end of the NPT, or saying that the end had already come and that the NPT lovers just hadn't figured it out yet. And some of this stemmed from very well-placed concerns about the state of the global non-proliferation regime and the proliferation landscape. And of course, you had North Korea, which had announced it was withdrawing and had been testing nuclear weapons. The Iran situation, which had been going on for decades. I mean, this is not a new issue. It's coming to a head now, we hope. But Iran's non-compliance had been an issue in the international community for a very long time. You had concerns about Syria, Iraq, Libya, black markets and nuclear technology with AQ Khan, which was feeding some of these clandestine nuclear programs. And all of this led to this general sense that this NPT regime was not working. And then you had the failed review conference, so the feeling that the parties couldn't even agree on the basics. I mean, that was really a disaster. And so the idea was that if 2010 was not successful, that was basically it. You didn't get another chance. And the history of the NPT is you get one good one, you get one bad one. And I'm convinced that the parties can break that cycle this coming review conference if they set their minds to it. So the 2010 review conference result really helped quell some of the real negative and alarmist rhetoric and the immediate concerns, because generally it was seen as a positive outcome and a success. But I always said it didn't signal the return to full health of the NPT, so we couldn't take that for granted. Maybe the NPT was off of life support, but was still in the intensive care unit. And so I think it's incumbent upon the parties to the treaty and civil society and others who care about this regime to ensure that steps continue to be made to bring it into fuller health. And I think there is still a belief in many quarters that the regime remains in crisis, and I think that's still a widely held view. It's just the extent how deep a crisis might be the difference of views. Now, in 2010, the parties demonstrated that consensus on many issues was possible. So it's not impossible. The action plan really embodies that. But consensus could not be reached on a number of critical issues. And it depended, on where you were, which group you were with, which country. For the United States and like-minded states, Issues that were important but where consensus couldn't be reached were how to deal forcefully and specifically with the serious challenges of non-compliance, and also how to enforce the non-nuclear weapon states' NPT commitments. There's no problem talking about the nuclear weapon states, but how did you deal with non-nuclear weapon states? There was no consensus on how to hold NPT violators accountable, which is something the parties should care about. No consensus on how to discourage abuse of the NPT's withdrawal provision, Article 10. Now, this in 2010 was seen as directed against Iran, but there's a real-world case of North Korea, which had withdrawn from the treaty after being discovered to be in violation. And there was also no consensus on the importance of the additional protocol for monitoring NPT compliance, notwithstanding the fact that the additional protocol had been adopted by consensus by all the members in the IAEA, I think in 2000. So for many of the non-nuclear weapon states, particularly in this case members of the non-aligned movement, which I will refer to as the NAM for shorthand, there was no consensus on how to accelerate nuclear disarmament and eliminate the threat of nuclear use. There was no agreement on timelines or deadlines for nuclear disarmament. No agreement on a global, universal, unconditional negative security assurance treaty. There was a non-aligned paper, and then there was a statement at the end of the 2010 conference that ticked off all of the issues on which that had been non-aligned desires, but that were not agreed. There wasn't consensus on how to further expand access to peaceful uses of nuclear energy, specifically access to sensitive technologies, enrichment and reprocessing, or fuel cycle technologies. So those were kind of outstanding issues. And as we get closer to 2015, efforts to address the regime challenges that existed from 2010 are taking the form of proposals and other initiatives to remedy what various states and groups of states are identifying as problems. And you, I'm sure, are well aware of this. There are calls for negotiations on a nuclear weapons convention to shortcut the step-by-step or building blocks approach to nuclear reductions and disarmament. There are proposals to establish an NPT secretariat to support continuous monitoring of NPT implementation. There's support for continued consultations on steps NPT parties could take in the event a party announces it's withdrawing from the treaty. And some of these are things that the US and others don't support, some of them they do. There are also discussions how to deal with non-parties, especially in the Middle East. Unfortunately, it's fact, Israel gets a disproportionate attention in this debate, not India and Pakistan as much, although I noticed from some of the working papers that you've done that there's much more attention to India and Pakistan. I think that's good that everybody get called out on this and be seen as presenting a challenge to the regime. So there are many opinions on the question of whether the NPT regime is failing. All agree that it's significant and challenged, but is it failing? So to frame the discussion, I wanted to first define what do we talk about the NPT and the NPT regime, because I think it's more than the treaty. And then I'd like to go through what I consider some of the key successes of the regime, because we tend to be a gloomy group, and so there's always a focus on what's not working.
How do you look at me when you say
No, I'm not looking. Well, you're a little bit like that. But the focus tends to be on what's not working, and we tend not to pay any attention or to sort of take as a given what has worked or what is working. And I think in order to have a fair assessment of the treaty, you have to look at both sides of that. And then what are some of the key failures of the NPT regime? And then I'll just draw some conclusions that I've reached and then have a discussion. So first, in defining the regime, I think we talk about it so much as just the treaty, but it's more than the treaty. And when the NPT came into force in 1970, it was open to all states, but it was a mechanism that tied together the various programs and mechanisms that the international community had been putting in place, in some cases since the 50s. IAEA safeguards predated the NPT, but the treaty negotiators tapped that as the indispensable tool for monitoring compliance with the treaty, and so it became part of this international framework. Atoms for Peace go back quite a long way, but it was basically the concept was enshrined in the NPT, and it was linked to safeguards and non-proliferation norms, and the IAEA again assuming a key role in providing technical assistance and cooperation in facilitating access to the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. The concept of nuclear weapons-free zones also predates the NPT, goes back to the 50s, And the Treaty of Tlatelolco beat the NPT by a year in terms of being completed. But the NPT recognized the role of nuclear weapons-free zones and acknowledged that there was nothing that would prevent countries from doing that. And I think over the years, the parties recognized that nuclear weapon-free zone treaties really can provide a very valuable regional reinforcement to the global regime. And so there's much more, I think, support for that now as they've seen how the free zones have developed. And so the NPT, as they call it, the cornerstone of the international nuclear non-proliferation regime, it basically codified the rules of the game necessary to prevent the further spread of nuclear weapons, to address the dangers posed by existing nuclear arsenals, and to ensure that peaceful uses of nuclear energy would be available to all parties. So while the NPT is the cornerstone, the global regime really encompasses all these other pieces. And they all contribute to the NPT, but it's all of these individual organizations and mechanisms. The regime is a complex international architecture that has grown in scope and complexity as the international community has been challenged by proliferation. There are export controls, for example. There are the PSI and the Global Initiative to Combat Nuclear Terrorism. And so when people criticize the treaty, I think it's been a very adaptable. The basic framework is sound, continues to be relevant, I think more important today than it was even at the time it was negotiated. And it's proven to be a very resilient framework that has allowed the international community to attach additional measures to it, all reinforcing this global architecture. So what are some of the key successes of the NPT regime? Let's start, the good news and the bad news. Well, on non-proliferation, I think there can be little doubt that the NPT has limited the amount of proliferation that we have seen, and it has come to embody a widely accepted international norm against nuclear weapons proliferation. Code of conduct, whatever you want to call it. If countries now seek to acquire nuclear weapons, it is generally seen as out of step with the current standards and as something that is unacceptable. And that is a good thing, and that is because of the NPT. Membership in the treaty is nearly universal, 189 states party, and with a few exceptions that you all know, it's compliant. So, that's a good thing. We can't forget the states that have joined the NPT and gave up the nuclear option in various forms. Argentina and Brazil, nascent programs, but were keeping the option open, decided to join first the Treaty of Tlatelolco and then the NPT as non-nuclear weapon states. South Africa, more than a nascent program, dismantled, submitted to international inspection, and showed that you could in fact put the genie back in the bottle, in a literal sense. And then Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus, who all had nuclear weapons on their territory, and could, if they had decided to retain possession, decided to move those weapons off and become non-nuclear weapon states and accede separately to the NPT as non-nuclear weapon states after the fall of the Soviet Union. And these are all really important. Now, there haven't been any new developments since then, but I think you have to remember that this can happen, and so some of these tough cases that we're looking at, nothing is impossible. It could be a change in leadership, a change in situation, so these are important. On the non-parties, there are only 3 states right now, South Sudan is one, other than the things, but the big states that have never joined the treaty, India, Pakistan, and Israel. And the NPT review meetings have begun to pay attention to these non-parties, recognizing that if the goal of a world free of nuclear weapons is ever to be achieved, it's going to have to involve more than just the P5, the NPT nuclear weapon states. And that's a good thing too, to keep focused on reality instead of into this narrow NPT that ignores the rest of the world, which bears on the ability of states to further reduce and that sort of thing. It's going to involve everyone. You had North Korea, which withdrew from the NPT. I'm not suggesting that that's a success, but it withdrew after its violations were discovered when the IAEA was implementing its strengthened safeguards inspection regime. And so that's the success. The members of the IAEA came up with a strengthened safeguards program. It worked. It discovered violations. It caused North Korea to announce it was withdrawing, but in fact, you need to look at the silver lining on that one, or the positive side. Iran. Iran sees NPT membership, I believe, as an important credential. and it has been reluctant to lose it and face the consequences. And international pressure that's been brought to bear on Iran, I think, has demonstrated that, because if Iran wanted to withdraw from the treaty, they could do it. They clearly see NPT and being in the NPT now as something that is good for them to do, and so I would see that as a success. If they withdraw from the treaty, then it would a whole different problem. Because of the NPT and because of discoveries in Iraq and so forth, the IEA member states have worked successfully to reinforce the safeguards regime, and you have an additional protocol. And adherence to the additional protocol is continuing to grow with NPT parties' support. And I just checked it today because I hadn't done this at home. 147 states have signed an additional protocol, and 124 have additional protocols in force. And in 2010, it was the Director General of the IEA, Amano's goal was to have 100 countries with APs in force by the 2010 Review Conference. And I think we made that. I think they made that goal. And now you've got 124 with 23 more in the wings that have just not brought it into force but have signed it. And I think regardless of what the debate is in the Review Conference about whether or not this should be universal, you need to look at the facts on the ground and say, well, it doesn't, whether it's universal or not, most countries have seen this as something they're going to do, and that's a positive thing. The fact that the P5 are supporting safeguards through national voluntary offer agreements and additional protocols is also, I think, a success of the NPT. The P5 feel a responsibility to do what they can to demonstrate their commitment to safeguards, and they're going as far as they can, with their national security programs, and I think that is the result of the NPT regime. And then you've got like-minded NPT parties are continuing to consult on ways to address abuse of NPT Article 10. And while there might not be consensus on that in 2015, the fact that this issue is now being institutionalized as an issue for discussion is also, I think, a success of the NPT. It's seen as a legitimate discussion by most parties. There are a few that don't think it's legitimate, but most parties see it as a legitimate area of discussion and recommendations. And then there are other non-NPT treaty-specific regime reinforcements, and those are in the export controls. The Nuclear Suppliers Group was created after India's 1974 nuclear test, but membership in the NSG has continued to grow. After Iraq's clandestine program was discovered, the Nuclear Suppliers Group members negotiated a trigger list to include dual-use items in about a year, which is, like the speed of light as these things go. Membership has grown with the addition of some key developing state countries, which is important, Brazil, South Africa for one. Now, the whole issue of India's membership in the treaty is an interesting one. We could discuss this. I think as a non-NPT member, I suspect that would really change the dynamic, my personal view. But the U.S. has endorsed India's membership in the NSG. But the fact that this has been an NSG only group, or an NPT only group, I think has been important. The NPT did not address non-state actors. It really didn't address non-compliance either, but it didn't address non-state actors. But in 1970, there wasn't a lot of concern about non-state actors and terrorism and so forth. That's a more recent concern. And so the NPT doesn't address that, but there are other mechanisms that have been developed. UN Security Council Resolution 1540, which obligates all states to refrain from providing any support to non-state actors. And that really takes on the non-state actor problem. And more states are buying into the 1540 activity. The 1540 committee has been extended. And when I was engaged in diplomacy in the run-up to 2010 and after that, I found that a number of states, particularly developing countries, really saw their 1540 support and participation as a way they could contribute to the non-proliferation and disarmament goal. And these were countries that were compliant with the NPT, but if you said, well, what are you doing, what have you done lately? We're very involved in 1540. And I think that's really important too, because that shows, again, international support for measures to deal with not only the state problem, but the non-state problem. And then I mentioned the Proliferation Security Initiative, Global Initiative. And let me continue on the successes, because I do think that the treaty has got many more successes than failures. On disarmament, First of all, it's the only multilateral treaty that requires nuclear disarmament, and we can't forget that. And I know there have been in various in the past, sometimes different delegations suggest that the requirement was negotiations and whatever. My view is the negotiations on nuclear disarmament, which I would see as leading to the elimination of nuclear weapons, and it's the only treaty that has, international support for that goal. And I would just say as an aside, I think the likelihood of negotiating another treaty that would do that today with the support of all the states that are currently members of the NPT, I would say is zero or negative. There's the 70-year record, or nearly 70-year record, of non-use of nuclear weapons is an important development. Now, it's not only because of the NPT, but I think as support for this regime and for reducing the threat of nuclear weapons has continued. This has been the NPT has been a factor, and it's recognized that it's in the global interest that this record be extended forever, and the U.S. at least says that publicly, and I think they believe that. If you read the 2010 Nuclear Posture Review, and Secretary Gates did that, I think the folks that were involved in that really do believe that's the goal. Now the idea is how do you get to the point where you don't have to worry about that anymore. Nuclear weapons haven't been eliminated, but there's been significant progress in reducing the stockpiles. I had figures on this, but I just saw something that a former colleague had written. In the U.S., it's the smallest nuclear stockpile since the Eisenhower administration. So whether you say it's 85% lower since the Cold War peak or 82% since the NPT, they're saying it's the smallest stockpile since the Eisenhower administration, going back to that time. The U.S. is committed to further negotiations with Russia. It's unfortunate that the political situation is the way it is now, because I don't know that we're ever going to get an opportunity that's as good as we've had it now with President Obama to do this, and I think there was a chance to take it to the next level. Hopefully there will be other opportunities in the future, but I think we're missing a good chance now. There have been a number of U.S. presidential nuclear initiatives that have produced a 90% reduction in tactical nuclear weapons. If you remember, I think it was George H.W. Bush removing nuclear weapons from ships and aircraft and moving them back from other countries, and that gets lost, I think, in the noise, in fact, with the change in the nuclear landscape. I mentioned the 2010 U.S. Nuclear Posture Review. That was very significant. I think it was a recognition that the threat now came from proliferation and from terrorism, and outlined a strategy for reducing numbers and roles of nuclear weapons. We updated the negative security assurance to remove all the conditions linked it to compliance, but I don't think that's unreasonable. Reaffirmed that the U.S. nuclear testing moratorium would continue until the CTBT was enforced, which was important. No new nuclear weapons, no new nuclear missions for the U.S., and that's very significant. And I don't think the Nuclear Posture Review got the kind of attention or credit that it deserved, but as someone who's been in the nuclear business, I worked on INF negotiations back in the old days, this was quite a significant redirection in the United States. As a result of the NPT, I think in large part, and the demand by non-weapon states for greater transparency, the P5 have been pushed to be more transparent. And post-2010, collaboration on confidence-building measures and verification has been significant, I think, as a result of the NPT and the importance that P5 placed on the treaty. Without the NPT, I don't know that would, maybe it would have happened, but I see a direct relationship to the need to be seen and to see and be seen as being responsive. I mentioned nuclear testing moratoria, holding for everyone with the exception of North Korea. 4 of the 5 nuclear weapon states have halted production of fissile material for weapons. Not sure that is because of the NPT, but it's certainly something now that we're committed to in the NPT context, and hopefully in 2015 all 5 will be able to pronounce that they're committed to a fissile material moratorium. And then I mentioned nuclear weapons free zones. We've gone from the Treaty of Tlatelolco from one treaty to now having 5 treaties that have been negotiated. The U.S. is a little bit behind the curve on these from the other P5 in terms of ratification, but hopefully if the P5 can work it out with the ASEAN states, they'll be in a position to sign the Treaty of Bangkok, which means at least all of the treaties will be signed, and I know Central Asia was signed in May. That was very important. They'll all be signed. They will be ratified by a number of the P5, and of course in the U.S. system, whether or not the Congress would ratify these treaties is a question. I'm not sure, I'm not going to bet any money on that, but I do think by taking the action of signing these treaties, at least we have made a political commitment to the goals of the treaty, and that's all very important because that will then cover, what is it, 125 countries or something with legally binding negative security assurances. Now, peaceful uses, there's an NPT preference policy that the U.S. has had. I'm not sure about the others, but historically it has advantaged the NPT parties. It meant when we were when we were selecting projects in the IEEA or allocating resources, it would be to NPT parties. And the majority of the NPT parties have benefited substantially over the years through national or regional partnerships with the IEA in technical assistance in every area you can think of: agriculture, food safety, industry, nuclear medicine, water, resource management, and nuclear power production. And this is, I think, one of the unsung successes of the NPT. Because of the strength of the NPT regime, countries worldwide have been able to take advantage of the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. And that, it seems to me that that is becoming more appreciated now, and I give some credit to the Peaceful Uses Initiative that Secretary Clinton announced in 2010, which has now been embraced by the IEA. So it's the IEA Peaceful Uses Initiative. But I think over $100 million has been put into that initiative now between the U.S. and partners. Additional money infused into the Technical Assistance and Cooperation Program in the IEA. And for the first time ever, I think it was 2012, states were actually commenting, and they were applauding the Peaceful Uses Initiative. And these were non-aligned states, and acknowledging that this showed that the supporters of this program really did care about Article 4, and that they were, putting their money where their mouth is. And I had never heard statements like that before. That was at the IEA General Conference, I believe, in 2012. Or maybe it was 2011. And to hear those kinds of statements about this, recognizing that this was a concrete demonstration of support for that, I think was very important. So maybe we've turned the corner on that, where there's a greater appreciation for the role that a strong NPT and non-proliferation regime has played in terms of providing access to peaceful uses of nuclear energy. We'll see. And now we'll move to the failures. And I would say that how you
only have an hour and a half.
I have quite a few. I would note that how a failure is defined would vary from constituency to constituency, just like how a success is defined. So what would be a failure for the United States or the P5 or the Western group might not be a failure for the non-aligned movement or civil society, and vice versa. So I'm going to throw a lot of these out there, and you can guess who might see them as failures. And I was trying to think not only what would have been failures from my perspective if I were still engaged, but also what I see as the failures that others see, because I think it's important for all states to understand where their partners are coming from, and what they're looking for and what they think they're not getting, and that's the only way you're going to find common ground. So first of all, on non-proliferation failures. The treaty has not prevented further nuclear proliferation. Now, if it were a Star Wars force field or something, maybe that would have been possible. But these are all products of humans, and they function as well or not so well, depending on how well the states, the humans, implement their, carry out their responsibilities. So you do have a case where you've got India, Pakistan, and Israel outside of the NPT. India and Pakistan with overt nuclear weapons possessors. Israel, policy of opacity and ambiguity, widely believed to have nuclear weapons. India, in fact, citing the 1995 decision to extend the treaty indefinitely as its justification for its 1998 nuclear tests. As someone who was very involved in the 1995 conference, that sort of broke my heart, but I guess it was a good hook. So it's not complete. Of course, you've got North Korea that's withdrawn. The NPT has not deterred other, what I would call wannabe states parties. It hasn't deterred them from trying to pursue nuclear weapons, although I think it has helped in remediating the problem. That includes Iraq, Libya, Syria, and Iran. Now, the Iraq and the Libya cases are resolved. Their questions remain about Syria's clandestine activities. That remains unresolved as far as I know. And Iran has defied the international community for decades, although the P5+1 process provides, I think, the best opportunity to address those issues. And I think, like you, we're all waiting with bated breath to see whether anything emerges at the end of next month. On North Korea, I mentioned it announced its withdrawal from the NPT and then openly pursued a nuclear capability. But the big failure here, I think, was that the international community, specifically the NPT parties, failed to respond to this action. There was no collective NPT effort to respond. And I remember being involved in this at the time and trying to figure out what would you do, because no one expected it. You know, it's like if deterrence fails, you know, you're not prepared. And so there was no kind of coordinated effort. And I think that looking at the withdrawal issue now is an attempt to say, should this ever happen again, God forbid, but the parties who have the greatest stake in the integrity of their treaty should be thinking about a collective response should another state announce, I'm out of here, and what do they do as a group? Because if the parties don't respond to that, who else is going to do that? Now, most of the world are parties, but still, it's a legitimate question. On other failures, again, of the regime, the IEA safeguards have not been enough to prevent violations. IEA lacks the budget, the intelligence capabilities, and technological resources needed to prevent and detect all NPT violations. Now, the additional protocol helps address some of that by providing more intrusive safeguards, but it's only good if the states accept an additional protocol and then if they allow it to be implemented on their territory. And the IEA members, in my opinion, have lacked the political will to punish violators, especially from their political group. And again, we come back to the human factor here. Is this all technical and widgets and being able to detect stuff, or is it the lack of political will to respond when the technical results are in? And I think the Director General Amano has been trying to take a very technical approach to safeguards now, which is seen as in contrast to his predecessor. But if he presents the facts and the parties still won't address them, then where's the fault lie? Is it with the treaty, is it with the IEA, or is it with the members? And then the NPT contains no enforcement mechanism, so violations go unaddressed by NPT parties, and the international community has not been united on how to deal with treaty violators. And that is whether it's North Korea, whether it's Iran, Syria, or any of the others, they just have not been organized to do it. It's been very politicized. And so as a consequence, rogue states and states that want to violate are able to defy the typically weak international response to the treaty. So this, I think, is a failure of the treaty regime and of the global regime. Now, disarmament failures. Nuclear disarmament has not been achieved 45 years after entry in force of the NPT. Tens of thousands of nuclear weapons still exist. And nuclear deterrence doctrine remains central to the security posture of U.S. and other nuclear weapon states. But many non-nuclear weapon states continue to rely on extended deterrence provided by nuclear weapon states for their security. Now, this would not necessarily be a failure for the United States, but it would be a failure for others. Another failure, I think, and I don't think the U.S. fits here, but not all the nuclear weapon states appear committed to eliminating their nuclear weapons. And the nuclear modernization programs of nuclear weapon states may introduce new or improved military capabilities. Now, as I said, I think with the United States, it's going to make clear they're not looking at new capabilities or new missions. They are looking at modernizing and upgrade as the force becomes smaller and smaller. They have to be sure it's safe and reliable and so forth, so that they've got a safe, reliable deterrent. There's been no consensus to negotiate a universal, legally binding negative security assurance treaty, which is seen as a failure by some states who think that was part of the original bargain. Some nuclear weapon states support the use of nuclear weapons in response to chemical and biological weapons. And if you look at each of the different negative security assurances offered by the the different P5, they're all different, and in fact, in some cases, they're more different now in some ways than they were before. The U.S. has moved to a more unconditional NSA, others have moved to more conditional NSA, so it's constantly shifting. States have been unwilling to move to a policy of sole purpose to deter other nuclear weapons, which is something that Gareth Evans and the ICNND and I think NPDI would like to see happen, and haven't been willing to do that. Although the U.S. Nuclear Posture Review did say that's the goal, it's just we're not there yet. Compliant NPT non-nuclear weapon states have to rely on a changeable NSA policy statement unless they're parties to a nuclear weapons free zone. And so for some states, this is seen as a failure of the regime. The CTBT is not enforced. And the CTBT is the one measure that is identified in the preamble of the treaty, and that's not enforced here 45 years after. FMCT, another one of the building block measures that's been around since the 60s, is blocked in the CD, and that would be an important measure. And then there are key nuclear-armed countries outside of the NPT and under no obligation to disarm, unlike the nuclear-armed countries in the NPT who are under an obligation to disarm in their nuclear weapons. And all states are obligated to disarm, period, but that's, I think, farther down the road. On the peaceful uses failures, there are two sides of this. One is an argument that the promise of access to peaceful benefits of nuclear energy remains unrealized. That's one criticism. On the other hand, some argue that NPT Article 4 provides a path to proliferation through civil fuel cycle activities, and they're sort of in conflict. Non-proliferation concerns are used as justification to deny parties, especially developing countries, access to certain sensitive technologies. Some argue this is a failure of the regime. Certain non-parties, I would say specifically India, have been afforded access to nuclear materials technology and know-how. And it's not just the U.S.-India deal, because there are a number of countries that have benefited substantially from the U.S.-India deal in terms of nuclear cooperation agreements with India. And India is not an NPT party. So one would say, well, what's the NPT preference policy? I think we could argue, well, we give preference, but it doesn't say exclusive. But I think that's that's injected a new debate. And while the U.S.-India deal didn't violate the letter of the NPT, many argue that it clearly violated the spirit. And so that's a discussion you're not going to win. Some argue that export controls disadvantage the developing countries and conflict with their ability to exercise their inalienable rights to access to peaceful nuclear energy. Some say that the IEA budget disproportionately favors safeguards over technical assistance and cooperation because the safeguards budget is fixed and is growing, while the Technical Assistance and Cooperation Fund is voluntary, although I would submit that that continues to grow. And I think it would be important to ask countries, what projects would you like to see implemented in your country that that are not being implemented because there are not resources? And I think when you put that question out there, it'll be silence, but it's a great political point of argument. There are concerns that the wannabe states have exploited IEA technical assistance and used civilian nuclear power programs as cover for illicit activities. These would be NPT parties that have a long-range goal of having a nuclear weapons capability, and so they've taken advantage of the technical assistance that's been available under the IEA as an NPT party, and the good faith of the states supporting that, and then 10, 20, 30 years down the road have broken out and realized that they've used all of this technology to go in a direction that was illegal. And this concern has been exacerbated by the growing interest in nuclear power and the desire of some states to not only have power reactors, but to have access to the fuel cycle. They would like to produce their own fuel, so they need enrichment, and they would like to reprocess the spent fuel, so they need reprocessing, and the whole debate over fuel assurances and fuel banks and that sort of thing. On the other hand, there are some, and there are some in the United States that have argued that pursuit by non-nuclear weapon states of enrichment and reprocessing technology violates the NPT. And I won't name names, but I'm sure you know who they are. There have been lots of articles. And there have been recent efforts by some former officials and academics to interpret the NPT as prohibiting the transfer of enrichment and reprocessing technology to non-nuclear weapon states. Now this is position, I think, on which you will never reach agreement, but the people that hold this view hold it very, very strongly. And if they're in power, that will be the view that is a violation. I think looking back over the history, negotiating history, I don't agree with that view. I think it's silent on the issue, which means, you know, they didn't think about it at the time, like compliance and non-state actors. So that's that was my best effort to think about, and there are probably many more, and I'd love to hear what others think about successes and failures on this. But that's the nature of the debate, and it leads to lively discussions here. So just thinking about some conclusions, I thought, is the NPT too big to fail? You know, we heard about this with all the financial institutions that were receiving government support during the financial crisis in 2008, 2009. And, you know, these large institutions, they're too big to fail, so they bailed them out. Well, if you look at, I think, the effects of an NPT collapse, you know, if the NPT were to collapse, and then you look at all the other architecture that's been, you know, either embodied in it or it's using, you know, the IEA and so forth, how could you keep the NPT from collapsing without all of these other things being called into question? I think it would be catastrophic, because in large measure because a lot of this is taken for granted, but without it, I think the world would be a very different place. And also, I believe that it would not be possible to recreate that today. And that's why I think a nuclear weapons convention or something like that, it's a nice nirvana goal, but you couldn't do it today in current political circumstances. And I think we need to look at before you throw this out, what would you replace it with? It's kind of like the Affordable Care Act. You can repeal it, but can you replace it? And I think here, you could repeal it, it could collapse, but I don't believe it's replaceable at this time. And I'd say, like those financial institutions that were too big to fail, it's large. You know, nearly every country in the world is a member of this treaty. And that, I think, says something about the importance of the treaty. It's inextricably linked to other key elements of the regime. The IAEA safeguard system, the IAEA technical assistance program, non-proliferation norms, nuclear disarmament. Again, it requires nuclear disarmament. It says that all states will do this, but clearly the states with nuclear weapons have a special responsibility. And it truly is the heart of this broader regime, global regime. The risk is great that if the entire edifice of the regime could collapse if the treaty lost the confidence and the support of the majority of its members. I don't think it'd have to be all of the members, but if you had a majority of the members, if the developing world decided we're done with this, they make up a majority of the members. If the nuclear weapon states decided we're done with this, you know, I think that would, you know, cut the legs out from under it. But I don't think we're at that point. I mean, I think we're at a point now where we're having vigorous debates. We're facing different kinds of proliferation challenges in the last 10, 15 years, 20 years than we've had in the first half of the treaty's life. And I think it would be a mistake to assume that it will always be there regardless of whether the parties meet their obligations or not. So I think there is a little bit of taking it for granted. There's a little bit of taking for granted that at a review conference you can have brinksmanship kind of activities and discussions that have no cost. I think we're at the point where that sort of thing could be dangerous to the treaty, and we need to think about that. The NPT can't be amended as a practical matter. If you just read the requirements for it, the chances of meeting all those conditions, I think, you know, I was never good at math and I never took statistics, but I think the chances of meeting all those requirements in today's world is in the negatives. And even if you got an amendment, it would only be enforced for those who ratified it. So again, you would be losing, instead of having nearly universal membership, you'd be losing members. There's little chance, as I said, that the international community can negotiate a new and improved NPT or any kind of comparable agreement that would attract the same level of support. So this is sort of the punchline, but I don't think it's a matter of the NPT or the regime failing, but I think it's rather the international community failing to use the tools that it has available, that it has created over the years to discourage proliferation, to promote disarmament, to ensure that the benefits of nuclear energy were available to all states. And they're failing to develop new tools and reinforce existing tools and to impose real and meaningful consequences on states that violate international non-proliferation norms. And it all comes back to the humans behind these regimes. You know, the man behind the curtain. Don't pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. What are we doing as nation states, as diplomats, as civil society and non-governmental organizations, what are we doing to see that these institutions that have been created, I think with the best interests, and in fact, if you look at them, all make a lot of sense and can do a lot of work. What are we doing to use them to advance this agenda? So could it fail and collapse? I think yes, it could. Do I think it's going to fail and collapse? I'm optimistic, so I think probably it won't, because I think the international community will jump in before it goes off the cliff. But I would be very interested in hearing your views on all those points, and I'll end here.
Thank you very much, Susan. I think you really provided a very, very comprehensive overview of the strengths, the weaknesses of the treaty, and I'm sure many of the points that you made will be particularly appreciated by the students who are in the simulation classes. And we have other people around the room who have not been as focused on many of these issues over the last several months.